All right, guys, welcome to the podcast. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the first episode of Black Mirror National Anthem, aka the episode where the guy has sex with a pig. So let's go through that episode. We're just going to talk about it, and we just watched it and give our thoughts a little bit about it. So, Scott, you want to kick us off with this one?
Yeah, well, so first off, like full disclosure, I'm a huge fan of Black Mirror as a series. It's probably actually one of my favorite series, like hands down. Definitely one of my favorites on Netflix. It seems like anytime I talk to people about it, they're kind of like fuzzy on like what it is, and normally try to describe it as kind of like the Twilight Zone of the digital age, so to speak. But what's so amazing just about the series in general is like it. Well, we don't really see too much of it in the first episode, to be honest, but it's hinted at a little bit. But we sort of start to see, or as the series progresses, you start to see these seeds of sort of kind of like technology meets the human spirit, but like what happens if there's like a twist, so to speak. And so that essentially tends to kind of become like the crux of the series over time.
Yeah, so that does seem to be one of the interesting themes going throughout all the episodes of Black Mirror, a relationship to how people interact with technology. And so in this show, how do you think that interaction begins? So you start off that, then I'll give you some of my thoughts.
Yeah. So episode one actually is probably one of the most clear episodes just because like pretty much like all the cards are on the table, so to speak. So essentially what happens is that the prime minister, I believe it's of England, gets like a call early in the morning, and then he comes into like the office or whatever, and then he sees this video of like this princess who basically has gotten kidnapped. And but what's interesting about it is that the video is like, I mean, it's they use like a proxy like IP address, so like the guy can't be traced and like all this other stuff. But it's shared on social media, and so it pretty much goes viral as soon as it's shared. And so they're like trying to take it down as much as they can. But every time they take one video down, like five more pop up. And so that's just an inkling right there of just like the power of the internet. Once like something is posted, it's like it's free, like it's let go, and like
Yeah.
you can't control it essentially.
There seems to be like an interesting play throughout the entire thing about a kind of strong parallel between democracy, a kind of idea of pleasure. I mean, we saw there with the kind of pig and like how there's just no decency as relates to some of
Yeah.
this stuff.
Well, first tracing back a little bit, we have to actually lay out that actual act itself. So, in the video, in order for the princess to be safely returned, the demands are that the prime minister has sex with a pig live on national television, and so that's actually is
Right.
like almost like the crux of like the essentially like the moral debate that happens within the episode. It's like, okay, like does this guy perform this heinous act in front of millions of his nation's people, or does he potentially allow for like this very prominent like widely beloved figure to die as a result of their inaction?
Yeah, and one of the interesting early scenes in it was there was a bunch of people in a newsroom, and they were debating whether or not they were going to follow this sort of optional order to not talk about it on air. And one of the
Yeah.
people, one of the ladies there, who she was debating, she was like, "Well, we need to show this. People, this is all about ratings. People want to show me, people need to see this, etc." So there was a kind of interesting parallel that was set up between the internet, where people could just freely access this stuff and access whatever they wanted to access, versus a kind of traditional sense of decency there, where the older networks, television, etc., were like, no, we're going to try to go up against this, but it was like they couldn't quite compete. They were trying to they ended up needing to compete with the internet, where people could do whatever they wanted. There were no guardrails.
Hmm.
So I felt like that was kind of an interesting comparison. And by the way, it was the same woman there who, how did she actually go about getting some sort of details from government? She ended up sexting. She was sending pictures of herself, naked pictures of herself, in order to get someone in government to send her like information about one of the hideouts. So there was a kind of interesting
Hmm.
parallel there between
Talk about like holes in the dam right there.
right. There's just an interesting parallel there between like pleasure and decency, where decency relates to guardrails. I thought that was one of the interesting parallels in the show.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Also, we start to see too, like as this, like as things sort of kind of like start to heat up, it's like things become more desperate, and the closer they come to the deadline in order to like save the princess, that's where they're really like pulling out all the stops, and they're just like going into almost like I think they just like storm into like it's like a warehouse or something, like trying to find the guy. And then of course the same journalist that did like the sex scene or whatever, like she was there like trying to get like a leaked story or whatever. And then they end up like shooting her accidentally, like not fatally, but like in the
Right.
thing, like in the leg or whatever. But just like the sense of desperation that just you see in the episode, like becomes more and more prevalent. But of course, like I mean, that's just the layout of a good episode, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So going through the episode like in order, do you think there was any significance in how they were unable to contain it, right? Because if you go through the story in order, it seemed like there was instances in each, where the government was trying to control the story and then they couldn't. For instance,
Hmm.
there was the porn star who was gonna go in there and try to fake it basically, and there was a reporter who snapped a photo of him going in there. They identified it as a porn star, and within seconds, people, within minutes, everyone was able to figure it out, and they knew that they were trying to cheat. Is there
Hmm.
maybe? Do you think there could be any kind of significance there? Because I was trying to think about it, and I'm not quite sure. Is there significance just in the inability to contain the story, as opposed to the inability of people to control their own desires to watch this thing that might be not be particularly good?
Yeah, it might be a little bit of both. So I think also building on to that too, you get this. What happens when you get these demands by like essentially like a terrorist, for example? Like the government immediately is trying to do everything they can to not meet those demands. Like they're trying to set up this different stage where they could have like this adult performer instead, like having like quote unquote sex with a pig, and then like do like a virtual like face plant onto like him to like avoid like the actual prime minister it looking like him. And
Mhm.
so like every step of the way they're just trying to do whatever they can to like not give in to these demands, or like to be like the more like powerful figure or whatever, or to seem like they're like in control of the situation when really they're not at all. And really that's the I think the big wake up call that you see about like halfway or two-thirds of the way into the episode is actually I think it's the one of the big newsrooms. They get this package in the mail, and it's actually a finger. And what we think it is it's actually it's alluded to be like one of the fingers of the princess, and so like that's really is kind of what takes things over the edge. It seems like, but yeah, I think it does vary. Um,
Well, yeah, well, that's actually a really interesting point, because it was actually the showing of the finger that really switched the public opinion polls. Because we'll
True,
notice that
yeah,
public opinion polls showed up really three prominent times during the show. At the beginning, or well, not quite at the beginning, but sort of in the middle point. Um, One of the guys comes up to the prime minister and says, "Well, the public opinion polls, they're on your side. They're sympathetic with you.
true,
They don't
yeah,
expect compliance. They don't want you to do it." But then they showed the fingers, and suddenly, boom, public opinion switched. Suddenly, but the thing though is, it was only a finger. Before, the possibility was someone was going to die. But then
hmm
now that it's just a finger, suddenly public opinion's completely fickle. But that
yeah,
seemed to have a serious significance. So then that was the second time when public opinion showed. It was like
yeah,
80% of people expected, oh, well, of course you've got to have sex with the pig in order. I mean, you don't want this princess to be killed. That would be terrible. And then, of course, at the end, after he does finally go through with the act of sex with the pig, we heard announcements that public opinion, that he was now a popular prime minister because he had sex with the pig. Like he had increased popularity, and there was photo shoots. He was talking with his wife. It looked like he had a good relationship with his wife, but of course, the trade off there was, with the good public opinion, it damaged his marriage.
hmm Yeah, well, that's, I mean, almost kind of looking metaphorically almost. I haven't even really considered that before. Of like, okay, like if you maybe perhaps there are like certain acts that like you have to perform as a public figure which just make you like sick to the core, which we clearly see that happen like after he has this, like he's just like vomiting his guts out just from like just how wretched he feels after he does this in like the bathroom. Meanwhile they're like trying to like reassure him like good job and stuff like this or whatever. And so like I think almost that's another note that's trying to get at too, like maybe like in order to get better views sometimes, and the public, you have to perform these acts which you would otherwise never dream of performing at all, just in order to win the populist vote over.
Yeah. So there's definitely that, and then but there also does seem to be a connection between popular opinion and how should I say, like, pleasure, right? Because
Hmm.
people a visceral sense of pleasure, right? Because there was also people who were like cheering it on, like in the audiences. People were like, oh man, he's gonna do it. He's gonna have sex with a pig. Like people were excited about it, and
Hmm.
we heard over
Yeah,
the TV.
like the pubs were filled up. It was becoming
Yeah,
almost like a soccer gathering. Like people were
and
gonna like, oh yeah, are you gonna watch the prime minister have sex tonight with a
of
pig? Like,
course.
oh yeah,
I
you're
mean, let's keep it
going.
real. Like, let's keep it real. If the president was gonna like actually do that, like, who's not gonna like? I mean, it's disgusting, and I
Yeah.
like to think that I wouldn't watch, but in the moment, I might click on for 10 seconds and then immediately click away after being completely disgusted. You know what I mean? Like it's
Hmm.
the biggest news story that's ever going to happen to you in your entire life. It's incredibly dramatic. It's it's the battle sport. It's the supreme anything, supreme drama, right?
Yeah.
But there's an interesting connection there between, what the public say they want, right? Like, oh well, yeah, I want this in a kind of visceral sense, but then saying, oh well, I don't actually expect you to do it. I don't know. Is there
Hmm.
anything there you think, or
Yeah, well, that's really sort of kind of like the real, I guess you could say, meat and potatoes of the episode, because it's like, okay, like what's like the message here, like what's actually happening. And so like once like everything does eventually come to fruition, he has to actually like perform this act in order to like save the princess. Like no smoke and mirrors, like it has to be him in the studio with this other animal performing um this act. But what's crazy is like as things progress, like during the scene or whatever, where like like he's actually following through with it, like the public is like shocked and like in awe and just like immediate almost kind of like humorous disgust. But then at some point, as it goes on, as like you just see like this pain and suffering in the prime minister's face as he's doing this for the betterment of his
people take the
country.
sympathy of it? Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't even say the sympathy, but
Mm,
almost like they start to see themselves and like, why am I even watching this? Like I was eventually
mm.
like when I came into this wanting to have like a sense of pleasure for me, like what like because like why do you watch anything is to as a form of entertainment, as a form of gaining something from it, as a form of trying to, oh, like this is fun essentially.
Hmm.
But then as that scene progresses, people are like, why am how am I supposed to take pleasure in this? Like this is not what this was intended for at all.
Yeah. And well, the interesting thing though is, you'll remember in the TVs they would sometimes throughout the show they had like TV throughout the episodes there were like kind of they had the news on in the background. Sometimes they had the news on in the foreground, but like specifically showing it. But sometimes it was on in the background, and a lot of stuff that people were saying were stuff like, "Well, this is the kind of stuff that PMs do anyway. They're having sex with pigs. They're doing disgusting acts anyway. Well, let's just have them do it straight away." I mean, you heard TVs saying things like that. So people
Hmm.
thinking that, oh, well, yeah, this is just what prime ministers do. This is, well, so they should just do it straight away on screen.
Hmm.
Kind of interesting. Um,
Yeah.
well, one of the other interesting things though that I guess kind of relates to this is, something that I caught on to was when the princess was released. She was released wearing a green dress, and I wasn't sure if that had
Hmm.
any kind of relation, because green kind of symbolizes, kind of envy or desire or something of the sort, Um, but I wasn't sure because it always seemed throughout the show that the princess represented a kind of decency, that we had to save her, right? It had to be a
Hmm.
princess,
Yeah. She's
right? It
like
had to
a
be in England. It had to be a princess because, well, of course, like princesses are the decency that, right? Like
yeah.
that's the thing
She's
that was going to be sacrificed. That's the thing
she's
that
like the damsel in
sacrificed.
distress. Yeah.
Right, but like those traditional values, the traditional mores, that's the thing that sacrificed. So it's interesting then that when she's released after this is done, she's
Well,
wrapped
hold
up
on.
in she's
We
wrapped
have
up
to
in
correct
green.
that. She's not released after this is done, because actually we
Well,
find
well,
out in
sure,
the bathroom she's released 30 minutes
before.
before
So it
he
didn't end up
actually has.
mattering. It didn't end up mattering. It was an art piece. But it seemed though that after society had agreed in some sense that we should do this, that we should sacrifice our decency, that we should have sex with a pig in order to save the decency. Suddenly, when she's released, she's dressed in green, as if those traditional values, the traditional mores, are altered in some way. And then the next time we see the princess, she's almost being presented entirely as a celebrity, right? It's gossip. It's sort of, oh well, oh she's pregnant, as opposed to being. Whereas at the beginning we were in looking at her, she was talking about going to a friend's wedding, a kind of traditional representation. But then we're talking about, oh, how she's pregnant. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it seemed like there was a transition which occurred from the beginning to the end of the princess, from the beginning to the end of the way in which our society thinks about tradition, thinks about decency. And so that because we were willing to save tradition through these disgusting means, we ended up transforming tradition itself. Is there anything to that, or am I just reading too much into it?
I think so. Yeah, maybe even also even looking as well, because because they actually find the princess on a bridge, like she's like drugged up or something, and they like some like just like passerbys like come across her or whatever. But what's interesting is that up to that point, nobody had even found her, and she was just wandering the streets. But why did nobody notice her? That like she was like out and about because everyone was watching the
Everybody was
broadcast.
distracted,
and
right?
so and so I think that's almost, you kind of have like those two, almost kind of like these two sort of kind of like weights like battling each other as well. It's like, do you give into like the immediate self gratification of like just kind of like going where your visceral desires or whatever, like the like is going to be like, hot gossip or whatever the heck or whatever is going to just like immediately catch your attention. Like, are you going to gravitate towards that, or are you going to gravitate towards that which is, more wholesome, or actually is trying to contribute to the betterment of the world? And so I think you kind of have almost
Well,
kind of those two representations weighing against each other as well,
there's
in that
also a
sense.
debate, though. There's also a debate, though. I mean, it does seem as though, when people were, I mean, you raised this point quite well. When people were finally given the thing that they wanted, or they thought they wanted, the sex with the pig, they wanted to see this, they were gathering at bars,
Yeah.
they were disgusted. But is it really the case that the tradition, the decency, the kind of guardrails that were represented by the old guard, by the princess, etc., is it really true that those things also were those things better or good? Because it's not what the people wanted, right? The people wanted to see the sex with pig. The people wanted to see that news.
Hmm.
They wanted to see the thing, right? Like, is there a trade off? Is the show arguing that there's a trade off that necessarily occurs, or is they saying that, like, are they saying that there's no midpoint, right? Because we like to think, oh well, there must be a compromise, there must be a midpoint. Is there something in the show that says there is no compromise? Once you make this transition, that's it. Now the princess is in green
Yeah, I think we
and
do
she's a
kind of see
celebrity.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we do kind of see that, like just kind of like this sense of no compromise, just in the fact that like even the show like tries to give like the prime minister outs, like it tries to, it's structured in such a way it's like, okay, like we're gonna try and find his IP address, we're gonna try and like hunt him down and like find the princess and rescue her and stuff like that. We're gonna try
Right. We're gonna
and
try to
like,
do both, but
we're gonna try and
good
put
point.
somebody else's face on an actor so that way you don't have this. But at the same time, the episode doesn't allow that to happen.
It's impossible, right?
It forces him to compromise and to give in to the demands of the public, which is to have sex with the pig in order to release the princess.
Interesting, yeah. But then the other thing, though, that's really interesting is the princess wasn't harmed. Like, is there anything there? Because the thing that
Yeah.
we thought was she was harmed when the finger got cut off, but it turned out the DNA was, someone else, the person who was, making this for an art statement or something of the sort.
Hmm.
It's art, it's symbolism for us. Um, she wasn't harmed. She was just transformed. So it's not like these traditional decency, the things that we think of is gone. We just think about them differently. We engage
Yeah.
with them differently. We see them
Oh,
differently. We see her in green. We see her as a celebrity.
and that's something else to examine too, because like, what would people think of the artist had he actually cut her finger off? I mean, first off, like, I mean, just the fact of kidnapping her, like, yeah, like that's its own kind of crazy thing right there. But like, if he actually did cut her finger off, like that would have been just like it wouldn't have any significance. But since he cut his own finger off,
Hmm.
it changes the tide a little bit. It shows like, okay, I never actually meant to harm her. In fact, I'm going to actually harm myself to make it look like I harmed her, to make you believe that I did.
I mean,
And so,
to be fair, you could argue psychological harm to be
oh,
sure,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah, but
uh, yeah, that's definitely interesting there. And then, of course, he kills himself after. The one presenting this
mm,
art to us, the one who's telling us this story about how, trying to tell us how the world really is, he kills himself. The artist who's trying to convey this message to us can't survive into the next world. Um,
yeah, and that also ties into almost kind of like I forget the quote off the top of my head, but it's like there a true artist is never realized until after his death,
hmm,
and you really almost kind of see that in the actual art marketplace too. Like take for example, like say you have like an artist who's selling one piece of his work, or like a piece of an artist's work is going up for sale while he's alive versus while he dies. It's like vastly worth more when he dies, because like there's a sense of like, okay, there's like a completion, like this is topped off, like nothing more can be added to this.
hmm.
It's like there's but yeah, that's almost something else to be considered too. Like maybe he didn't kill himself because he was trying to be a true artist, which I think that could make that argument. Maybe there was also the concept of like, oh my gosh, I can't survive in this world where people want to do this, where they actively want to watch someone have sex with a pig, and like maybe he
Yeah.
killed himself out of that reason. I think maybe
And
it
so
might
the
be a little bit
artist
of,
is dead. Like the
yeah.
artist is dead because there can be no art because of the fact that there's no
Mm,
decency left. People only want the thing that's pleasurable. They only want to
yeah.
see the sex with the pig. So how could I ever make art again? Is
Yeah,
there anything?
they want the shock value. They want all of the laughter without any of the
Hmm.
sustenance.
So the final art is that art is dead, right? Is there
Mm.
kind of crazy? I don't know. Maybe we're just reading too much into it.
Yeah. It's yeah, I think well uh, interestingly enough, like if I were to suggest an episode for someone to get into Black Mirror, it would not be this. Because like if you try to show this to like a
It's
conservative
shocking.
person, like they're immediately gonna tune out, dude, because it's like almost like too much. But at the same time, like that's what makes the episode so powerful. Is like you can't even
You
imagine
know,
what it would be like to be in that situation of like the prime minister like having to perform that act in order to
I
to
mean,
save the
yeah,
princess and all this
I was
stuff.
thinking about this as I was rewatching it. It made me realize, this was never one of my like sort of top favorite episodes, but it's also but it is without a doubt one of the most memorable episodes.
Oh,
Right?
for
When we were
sure.
talking
Yeah.
about,
Like you like if you watch this episode, you're not gonna forget
right, and
it.
I remember,
Even if you try
when
to.
we were talking about, oh, what episode are we going to cover first, and you're like, oh, well, the first episode. I was immediately like, oh, the one where there's sex with the pig, because I remembered it so strongly, so
Yeah.
clearly. You can't forget this episode, right?
Hmm.
In a way that some of the other episodes that may have been better, some of the episodes that I do think of as maybe better, I don't quite remember the premises clearly. I would have to rewatch them, and I'm sure that
Yeah, there's
when I
even some other ones.
rewatch them, I would
Yeah, what is there like
remember.
three or
But
four seasons right now? Yeah, I'm looking forward to almost kind of going through this series too, because like I'm sure there's some other ones that like I've wanted to rewatch Black Mirror for a while, but I just haven't. But now like almost like this deeper analysis with you, I think will actually open up more doors. But yeah, I mean that is a great point though. Like even into like some of the other episodes, like I remember like some of like the premises a little bit here and there, but like the one that sticks out the most with this is like guy who has sex with a pig,
it's
and
also
so
it's a very straightforward and clear premise. Some of the other Black Mirrors, the premise can be a little bit, you know,
yeah, kind of muddied
confusing,
or
a little bit.
artsy or
Right.
yeah, a little bit
It's harder to follow.
less
This one's
premise.
very straightforward, very easy to follow, and it also makes sense that it's the first episode because it feels very early. It feels like we're seeing the transition away
Yeah.
from decency right before our eyes.
Yeah.
Um,
Question for you though, Peyton. Do you think there's a reason why this specific episode is called National Anthem though?
hmm. Ooh, that's interesting. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe it's because the national anthem is dying in a sense. Like the national anthem now is pleasure. It's we do what we
Hmm.
want. There is no true national anthem anymore. Our
Yeah.
nation is like the guardrails, the princess, they're gone, and so the only thing that we have left is our pleasure. It's what we want. It's the thing that we click on. There's clickbait now on the internet. Maybe there's something to that idea that
Yeah,
our new national anthem is dressed in green. It's just our desires. It's just the
yeah,
thing that we want when we see it.
yeah. Maybe this maybe I think that's a good point, or maybe this concept of like of this unification of wanting to long after or witness the extreme or the shocking, like maybe that is the new national anthem. Maybe like all the
Mm,
values that we've had in the past have just kind of like fizzled away, like
right.
we've
We've
forgotten
replaced them
about the princess in the streets because we're consumed with, you know, viewing that which is
with
heinous.
which is shocking. Which if we had noticed the princess in the street, then he wouldn't have even needed to do it.
Yeah.
So it's
Oof,
completely
yeah,
shocking.
I mean, sheesh, right there, you know. So
Yeah. Well, anyway, guys, I mean, thank you so much for tuning into this one. I mean, we said that this series starts out with a transition from decency and guardrails moving in through pleasure. That's what we saw in the first episode, and as we
mhm.
go through the series of Black Mirror, we're going to see that transition further on. So, thank you so much for tuning in. If there's any other shows or episodes you'd be interested in taking a listen to, make sure to let us know. So, for now, tuning out. Thank you guys so much for watching.
All right, have a good one.